Welcome to the Inktofilm podcast, where we read the book
and then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Jonathan Nolan's 2001 short story, Memento Mori, and Christopher Nolan's 2000 film, Memento. So I've always loved the idea of these two brothers, and one of them writes a short story, and one of them makes a film based off of that brother's short story, and both go on to be pretty successful. Obviously, you know, Christopher Nolan has had this huge career, but Jonathan Nolan too. I mean, he's involved in Westworld and all this stuff, and these two guys are super talented, and I don't know, it's just a story that I've always, like, the story of that has always seemed cool to me.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by siblings who can work together this closely. Like, you know, my brother and I get along. I feel like we could probably do a project like this, but you have people like the Coen brothers, or more recently like the Duffer brothers, who are like co-directing and co-creating something like this. And, you know, Jonathan Nolan, I guess he wasn't as directly involved as something like the Coens both directing a film,
right.
but you know, he wrote the screenplay and it was his story seed. And I feel like that's definitely what the short story felt like to me. Is like a really interesting study in the seed of the story that Christopher Nolan would take on to make the movie.
It's really, it's interesting in that way because as we talked about, and you know, obviously with the years that these came out, this short story Memento Mori was published in Esquire magazine in 2001, March, I believe, of 2001, and you can read that. It's online for free. You can just Google it and read it. It's a pretty short read. I recommend it. It's a good read, in my opinion. But it's interesting because this film came out before it, even though it was sort of the original, and it says adapted from, based on, or whatever, in the opening credits to the movie. So what essentially that means is that Christopher Nolan was basing it off of an unpublished story from his brother. So in that way, it's like the adaptation process was started at the same time as the creation process. So it's almost like these two were made together, right? Like almost more than your traditional adaptation.
Well, I assume that what happened was Jonathan Nolan wrote the short story, or at least like the template or the outline of the short story, and then Christopher Nolan took that and started running with it, and then it was published later. Like, I'm assuming it was almost fully written when he started his screenplay for it. So
I have a little story about that I read in an interview. I'll just read it verbatim here. So this is Christopher Nolan talking about Memento. And he says, "The short story was written by my brother Jonathan. I think he had a rough draft of it, but he told it to me verbally while we were driving from Chicago to LA. I asked if I could go ahead and write a screenplay of it while he kept writing his story, because it was taking him a long time to get it into the form he wanted, and he said fine. We both agreed that the most interesting approach to this concept by far was to tell the story from the first-person point of view, putting the audience or reader right into the mind of the protagonist." So that's kind of what I was saying, right? Like it's almost happening at the same time because it was just a rough draft at that point. He wasn't even done with it. Yeah, he was just given verbally the story and then ran with it and changed it in ways, but there are similar beats within it, obviously. Like the major touchstones are the same. But you could almost see I mean, I don't know if it perfectly lines up, but you could almost see Memento Mori as a prequel to the film.
Yeah, it depends on if you believe our narrator or the first person perspective we get from Leonard.
Are you talking about
in the film?
In the film,
Leonard in the film, yeah.
I thought you were going to say it depends on if you believe Teddy a little bit too.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
In that way, it also believing Leonard, because it's like you believe one of them, or I guess you could believe both of them. But Leonard's clearly I don't want to spoil anything right off the bat, so
that's true. I guess we should keep it a little more spoiler free as possible, just in case you're curious and you check this out and you're like, oh, what's this Memento movie? Do I want to check it out? First off, I highly recommend it. This is a great movie in my opinion. One of my favorite Christopher Nolan movies. Super low budget by comparison to what we would see from this director going forward, but for an early film, I'm just kind of blown away by the technical brilliance of the screenplay. The sort of format of the film is so unique and interesting to me that I'm sort of fascinated by it.
I've talked a lot about these filmmakers who are students of film, and one of my favorite things is seeing people more raw when they're first starting out. And this wasn't his first film, but Christopher Nolan in this film, you can see he is like somebody like Spielberg was leaning on people like Hitchcock and other people when he was coming up, and you can see that Nolan is basically the same way. He's leaning on these like noir 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s like noir narration, black and white, unreliable narrators. All of these things are built into this story here, and I think it really is kind of his love letter to noir. And this is, I would say, part of a big like neo-noir movement that happened in like the 90s and 2000s, where young filmmakers were coming up studying a lot of like older noir films and saying like, why don't we just take this and turn this into something more modern and something more updated and see how it holds up. And obviously the format and the playing with form that Nolan does with the way that he gives us the non-linear story, the way that we're given like two stories simultaneously heading towards the same point, one going backwards, one going forwards. That's just in general, that's just a brilliant move in terms of telling an interesting story and playing with the form of film and doing something that you would be very difficult to articulate to an audience in a book. But Jonathan Nolan does something similar in the short story.
Yeah, and like I don't want to say, I don't know if it's even possible to tell a story like this in fiction, but maybe it would be, because I don't know if I would have thought it was possible to tell it in a movie either, and if I hadn't seen this movie. And the way, that's what I was saying, like the brilliance of the way it's constructed is astounding. I'm going to shout out a YouTube video by Lessons from the Screenplay, which I think is a YouTube channel we've talked about before, where he breaks down sort of the structure of the film and how there's essentially a backwards moving in time plot and then a forwards moving in time plot, and how you can like plot them out on a straight timeline, and how the climax of the film essentially happens in the middle of the story. And like that, just the idea of that is so crazy to me. Like that's to construct a story that works that way is so difficult, and the way that the climax comes together in this movie is quite astounding. But before we really get to the movie, we should focus on the short story, I suppose.
Yeah, I do want to say one more thing about just how this viewing and the reading struck me. The interesting thing about this film is that when you're rewatching it, it's so engaging because it's jumping back and forth so much that it's almost incoherent. Sometimes you're like, where are we again? Or what are we doing right now? Like what's going on? And then it takes you a second to get caught back up. And that's kind of like Leonard. Like every time he flips over and he's into like having to learn who he is again and figure out like where he is and what's going on. The viewer is feeling that as well. Like you're like, oh, what's going on? And you're kind of having to settle back into each scene. And I feel like that keeps you on repeat viewings. Even though you know what's going to happen, it keeps you kind of whiplashed. It keeps you kind of like, oh, what happens here? I can't really remember exactly what happens at this moment. And I think that's something fun to just the fact that the rewatchability is there, I think is something to note.
Yeah, no, I agree. Because I think I was going to ask you, I think I've probably seen this movie, I don't know, 8 or 9 times, maybe. Quite a few, I think. And you're right. It's not like I go into it knowing exactly what happens next, because the story is so disjointed by design. And Christopher Nolan talks about it in these interviews, and it's talked about on that channel, that video that I'll link in the show notes. The format was done to create that sense of, at the beginning of every part of the backwards moving story, you're presented with a situation where you're going, wait, what's happening? And you have no idea. Like, as a viewer, you have no idea what's happening right now. But neither does Leonard. So you're in his shoes in that sense. Both of you are there together, completely confused about what's happening in the current moment. And the way that is made interesting and it doesn't completely lose you is actually really masterfully handled, because it's done through a combination of things. Like one of them is we get this forward moving plot, the black and white, him talking on the phone about Sammy Jankis. That essentially moves forward in time. And so that gives us a little bit of something to hold on to, right? And we also get some flashbacks, which are more like traditional narrative types things. And then at the same time, you have all these questions that are threaded in that drive you along through the story, because in every scene, there's something that doesn't make any sense. Like his window has been shot out. He has written something on the back of a photo and then scratched it out. And like there's all these little things that make you go, well, why was that there? And so these questions build up enough interest in the viewer to where you're along for it, even though you're so disoriented. Because every time we get a new scene, it essentially answers one of those questions, but tends to bring up a new one.
Yeah.
Which is just, I mean, the way that was meticulously crafted is pretty astounding.
And that's like the grasp that he has on story and narrative is definitely just like, he's a genius. And but I wanted to ask you, because I have heard people talk about this movie and say that it's just all right. And I think that that has something to do with how invested you have to be, like how you have to really buy into the story, because as you talked about, the climax happens like in the middle. And so when you get to the end, things that you kind of thought, so because we, like, I guess it's not a spoiler because it's the very first scene, but we see Teddy dead at the very, very beginning.
We see him execute a man that we don't know who he is and we don't know why.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
we learn later that it's
throughout
Teddy
the story, we learn that it's Teddy.
Yeah.
But so because we know that happens, the ending, and because the climax is in the middle, we know what's happening at the ending, kind of like we've pieced everything together, which is part of the fun of the film, I would say. But also it leaves you kind of like the it doesn't take you to the cliff and then drop you off for the ending, if you know what I mean. Like it doesn't come down. It feels more like it kind of plateaus, and it feels like it's leaving you on like because it's leading you into the beginning of the other story. But what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't feel like an ending, and I feel like that's something that I've heard people complain about, is that you just like the events played out and then there was no real ending because the ending happened in the movie, midway through or so.
Okay, I don't agree with that, but I think I can see why people might say that. It's hard because I feel like we really have to dig into the plot of the movie, which I'm not sure if we're ready to do yet. So we might need to kind of just stick a pin in that for later. Yeah. Because I do want to kind of try and engage with that criticism. I do think there's also a valid look at this as a movie that is at its heart about a man who is being motivated by the murder of his wife, essentially fridging a character to motivate this man on a revenge, hunt, which like on the surface sounds like kind of like a million other movies, right? So
on the surface, that's like your prototypical noir film, like detective cop noir film, like something.
And if
like
you're
that.
not into that, and you hear that premise, and you're like, I don't want to watch that movie, then the idea of like, oh no, but you have to see like all the cool ways in which it plays out because of his Anterograde Amnesia and all this stuff. Like someone might be like, I still don't care, because ultimately that's what the movie is at its core, right? Even though like I would argue Christopher Nolan plays with that even more, but. So I can see maybe some of that criticism too, leveled at this movie, which I'm sympathetic towards. But I guess we've talked about it before that like we're these kind of movies are aimed at people like us, our demographic, and so it's hard for me to say I completely don't enjoy it, because I did still enjoy this movie, regardless of that being the premise. It was good enough, and then everything else on top of it just elevates it to another level to me, to where I think this is a truly great movie. I don't know. So when you're saying other people have said this to you, do you agree with them, or are you somewhere in the middle, or where are you at?
No, I brought it up because I was having a conversation with somebody about Memento, and they were telling me that like their problem with it is that it doesn't feel like another movie, and I was kind of saying that's part of why I enjoy it, is because it's like I like a film that's different for the sake of being different. Sometimes for a new experience, we're getting a disjointed story, not in like a Tarantino way where like it's like a disjointed narrative. It's like fully taking the form of like time and memory and flipping them in a way that we never have seen before, and we never will see again.
And that's kind of brings me back to the point of that video, and I totally agree with it. And honestly, like this is all stuff I was kind of writing down anyway, and it just I was reminded of the video I had seen in the past. But yeah, like this is all done with a purpose of simulating the mental state of the protagonist and forcing the viewer into that disorientation along with the protagonist of this. So it's not just done just to be weird and different, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like the equivalent of, say, like everybody talks about the scene in Saving Private Ryan in Spielberg Saving Private Ryan, where they're on, it's the beaches in Normandy and the D-Day, and it was like the shakiness and like basically there's just the kinetic nature that he brought to that. It's like he uses the camera to engage you and make you feel like you're there. And in the same way, Nolan is doing that with the format of this film. He's saying like, this is what the character is going through. So we're going to put you in his shoes physically, like along with the narrative of the story baked into it. We're going to have you feel the same way. And that's the thing. It's more than just like a viewing experience. It really is like an experience. It's a mental experience because you are as disoriented as Leonard.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Jonathan Nolan's short story, because I feel like I have a lot more to say about the film, but I'm not ready to get into all of it yet. But the short story itself is an interesting read. I think it attempts to do some similar things, but using different tools. One of the main ones being that we get a second person narration where it's like you, and it's somebody talking to, it feels like they're talking to you, the reader, but then you realize that it's sort of, and his name's not Leonard in the story. His name is Earl in the story. And Earl is sort of talking to himself with these you second person parts. But then we also get this third person narration speaking about Earl in sort of an omniscient way. And the disorientation there comes from that, like, not really knowing who we are, what perspective we're in, and whether or not what is being told to us, we can believe it or not. Is it reliable or not? That sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And just to track the story as I kind of understand it, essentially Earl is in a hospital, and he wakes up and he immediately has to like figure out where he is. He reads some stuff written on like the ceiling fan, I think, or on the ceiling above him, telling him that you're in a hospital room. This is where you live now, something like that. And he calls himself the 10-minute man. He knows he has a condition, and just like in the movie, his wife was murdered, and he is like constantly having to relive the like finding that out, essentially, because every time he wakes up, he kind of has to find that out again. And that's like the really tragic heart of this character, right? This is a man who is stuck in the eternally in the like most horrific moment of his life. It's like the last real memory he has, right? And the idea that he's caught in a loop of the worst 10 minutes of his life playing over and over and over again. Like it's amazing that he's not completely driven insane by it, honestly.
Yeah, I found so you were talking about the disorientation from the kind of third person narration. Mm-hmm. It's really weird because it's almost as if he's recounting the events when in some like alternate, I don't know, timeline or something like that, where he's able to gain all of his memories back and still recount this story like to himself almost. Does that make any sense? It feels like
it not really, but I also like get what you're saying, because I felt the same way. Like the narration almost doesn't make sense in that way.
Yeah. Because it's like clearly he has this amnesia, or whatever it's called. What was it?
Anterograde amnesia, I think is what they call it in the film. I'm not sure if they name it that in the story or not. I don't remember.
So he has this disease, and there's no way that he could, or this injury. There's no way that he could have this sort of coherent and like continuous like thought to recount everything. And yet that's the perspective we're getting it from. And then sometimes it's also like directed towards us. Which would be towards him, basically.
Towards himself,
yeah. I find it to be really interesting.
It's almost like, in those parts, it's like, I don't know if maybe we're supposed to be thinking that's in a notebook or something that he's reading, right? Because that was kind of the feeling I was getting.
And some of that time, like there's a couple times where we kind of are.
Yeah.
So I actually had a question with the book and the movie in this case. I guess specifically the movie, because this backs up my point. He repeatedly is saying... So the last thing he remembers is his wife.
Yeah.
And like his wife dying and the person basically that he killed and somebody who like knocked him out. How is it that every single time he switches back, he's able to tell people that he has a disorder or a disease? Because he wouldn't remember that technically, right? He wouldn't remember being diagnosed with anything.
Yeah, I don't know. A lot of this is kind of unclear, and you know what? Honestly, I don't think it's really cheating, because these sorts of disorders and sort of like mental things that can happen, and this is a real thing that can happen. It's so rare that there's not a lot of hard and fast rules about it. And I think it is inconsistent. I think there are certain things that people can learn, and he talks about conditioning in the film, and that's a way that sometimes people are able to learn things. And so maybe he's conditioned himself to know that he has a condition or something. You know what I mean? Like there could be answers to this, and we're not really given them.
Yeah, it was just. I mean, I wasn't like trying to nitpick. It was just something that occurred to me. Legit. It was just. I was just thinking like, oh, this kind of like in a way I can see where like if he had a tattoo that said like you have a something.
And maybe he does. We don't see all of his tattoos.
Right.
We see most.
I'm willing to forgive it. I'm willing to like say like, oh, who really knows?
Well, and also like he has a tattoo that says John G. raped and murdered my wife in the film, right. But we also know that this is something that he supposedly remembers. So you could say, why did he feel the need to tattoo that on himself? And he, and I think the implication is he's worried he'll forget.
And that's actually comes back to the story in the short story.
Yeah.
Where they talk about like time as the enemy of motivation, basically, or the enemy of anger, and the way that like as time goes on, it heals all wounds, and it like kind of quells people's anger, and it like people are able to forgive, and forgiveness is kind of weakness in the eyes of someone who's seeking revenge or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was fascinating in the way that he was extrapolating this out, and because he lives his life in these segments, he's able to like continue that vengeance and that anger, and because like he does have
can't fade for him.
Yeah. Right. It can never fade. It'll always be the last thing he remembers. It'll always be right there, which I found to be like just internally a really interesting look at someone with I never thought about memory in that way before.
Yeah, I mean, and the tragedy of that character is pretty powerful to me because of that. But I found a line here that I wrote down that speaks to what you were talking about with the third person narration. Just quickly here, and I wrote it down because it stood out to me as being odd. This is when we're in third person narration, so the he here is referring to Earl. It says, maybe he begins to cry. Maybe he just stares silently at the picture. And so that's uncertainty by the point of the omniscient narrator, which is odd, because if you're an omniscient narrator, you should know what happened, right?
Right.
So that implies that the omniscient narrator maybe doesn't know everything either, which is disorienting in a way, right? Because then it's like, can I even trust what this point of view is saying to me?
And I think the whole point of the both stories is just like you kind of have to decide what you want the story to be, what you piece together, because ultimately, like even in the end, there's like the whole thing with like the taxi and the cop car, and it's like, was it a cop car that he was leaving in, or was it a taxi? You know what I mean? Was it a good ending or a bad ending? You kind of have to piece it together for yourself and decide what.
Well, it's disorienting because it seems like maybe he killed the man that he was meant to kill, but that comes right back around to the tragedy of this character, because he immediately forgets they did it.
Which that scene became a scene in the film, I believe, basically the scene
right.
where
well,
he can't
that's
get
why
a
I was
pen.
saying like you could kind of see this as maybe a prequel to what we see in the movie, which is I don't want to go. We'll talk about it more when we get to the movie, because it could be kind of spoilery to get into why. But
okay. I had one more thing that I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned the institution and like Earl being in the institution, and I found an interesting line that kind of leads into the movie. We can talk about it more when we get there, but after his wife's death, Sammy is shown sitting in a mental institution, which lines up with the idea.
You're talking about in the movie?
In the movie, yeah, Sammy.
Yeah.
He's sitting in a mental institution briefly after someone walks in front of him, and before the scene cuts back to Leonard on the phone, Sammy is actually replaced by Leonard sitting in the same chair. There's actually a shot of it. I watched a video that was showing it. So
I actually caught it this time watching it too. I noticed.
Did you? Yeah. So I thought that was cool. And it says this supports the conclusion that the tragic end of Sammy's story is actually an event from Leonard's own past, just as Teddy later tries to convince him. So it's like you can choose to take that as a clue and say like this is definitely what happened, or you can say like, is Nolan just fucking with me and messing with memories and playing into that?
The Sammy Jankis stuff is honestly like getting kind of spoilery for the movie, so I think we hold off on talking about that more. I do really want to talk about it, but let's hold off just a little bit, finish off the short story.
Okay, yeah, let's finish it up.
Okay, so I have a couple more things I want to say about the short story, and I have a section here that I actually want to read, because one of the things that's nice about this, I think one of the things that the short story does that the movie does a little bit of, but the short story actually does it a lot, is in some ways liken his experience to everyone's experience, and how we all forget things, and how all of us live in sort of a transient state of shifting identities. And I have a quote here that kind of sums all that up, in my opinion. And I thought it was cool because that's something that they touch on a little bit in the film, but you know, the short story I think is able to lay it out more clearly. We're all at the mercy of the limbic system, clouds of electricity drifting through the brain. Every man is broken into 24-hour fractions, and then again within those 24 hours. It's a daily pantomime, one man yielding control to the next, a backstage crowded with old hacks clamoring for their turn in the spotlight. Every week, every day. The angry man hands the baton over to the sulking man, and in turn to the sex addict, the introvert, the conversationalist. Every man is a mob, a chain gang of idiots. End quote. So I thought that was a cool quote. You know, the idea, and I feel like we all feel that way sometimes, right? Where like one of us is like, you know, talking on the podcast, and then after this, like the next person's like the hungry guy who's going to go and like raid the fridge. You know, like it's almost a different person. You know, it's like it's weird.
It really makes you get in your own head, because it comes to even like motivation, or like the moment of you doing there'll be times in your life where you do something or you say something and you're just really proud of yourself and you're like, wow, I really killed it. And he mentions like every man has that moment where, you know, like you understand the world, you understand the universe, like it's at your grasp, like you've got everything within the palm of your hand and you could do anything. And then the next minute you're just like in like you're the opposite of that. You're just like you're dealing with you know, something going on in your life, or like something that takes your attention away from it, and then you're almost like shifting into a different person until you come back around to that moment where you just like everything lines up again for you.
Yeah. That's like the I've heard different rock stars talk about the sort of weird experience of being on stage in front of hundreds of thousands of people in these massive like festivals, and just being the center of everyone's attention, right? And then like the next day they're at home and they're having to take out the garbage, and like how weird of a change that is, and a shift, and how they have to, like, which one of them is the real person in a way, you know what I mean? And like it can be this weird, strange thing.
But even for like everyday people, like you know, like sometimes things will come easy to you. Sometimes like you know what I mean? Like I'm sure even with your writing, it'll be like one day you'll sit down and it'll just be gold all the way through. Yeah. And then the next day you might sit down and you're just like, what was it yesterday that was so special? Like how did I tap into that? And how do I replicate it? And that's the kind of stuff that makes me think like what really is that? You know, what is that that
I mean, you could break it into a million pieces, right? Like the version of me that loves watching a film like Memento is almost a different person than the version of me who will occasionally turn on an episode of Supernatural and just like have it on and have it just be this trashy watch, you know, like not to shit on that show, but like I actually do watch it, but I know that it's not highbrow, you know, like super smart television, which is what I don't normally watch. And in some ways, like you could say, like, oh, it's stupid to try and differentiate. They're all the same person. Maybe that's what it is. Like, it's all facets of the same person. It's all pieces of your brain or pieces of your personality, maybe. But regardless, I think it is interesting to think of it that way. And this story is trying to shine a spotlight on that and show a man who is that to the extreme, where every 10-minute section of himself is more disconnected from the next than it is for you and me. So the other thing in the short story that is kind of interesting is that it does progress chronologically unlike the film, right? Like it's fairly straightforward as far as timeline, even though you're disoriented in perspective. And the character himself is even though it's not in first person as much as this like second person deal, he seems confused all the time too, right? So he's confused about what's happening, and that's kind of done by big jumps. Like he's in a whole new place now, and he doesn't know how he got there and what exactly is happening. And it jumps again, and he's somewhere else, and then it jumps again, and like you said, he's in the back of a car, and he doesn't know if it's a taxi or a police car, and he doesn't know if he thinks there's a dead person, and he doesn't know if he killed him or not.
Well, it seems like he's like smiling one way or another. Like I think that he did, whether he got a cop car or a taxi out of there.
I think he did too, but the story that's how it. I'm saying that's how it establishes this sort of like disconnected confusion that you get in the movie. Like that's the way that the story does it. Another thing that I think is interesting, Memento Mori. Do you know what that means?
No, I couldn't tell you what the Mori part means.
So I don't remember its exact translation, but it's essentially like remember to die. And it's the idea of someone, I guess it's a practice where like people would keep like a skull or, I don't know, some sort of keepsake from a grave. And they would keep it as a memento, just like you would, which is like the name of the film. Just like something that's like reminds you of the past, right? But a memento mori is not just a reminder of the past, but a reminder of death in a way too. Like remember that you're going to die one day, or remember this person who died, or whatever it may be.
And I mean, the story makes the point of telling the story of like in the old days, people would die and they would have to have a bell set up in order to make sure.
Yeah.
And so it has to do with like coming back from the dead or dying basically. And so him getting that bell, it would be his memento mori then, I'm assuming.
Maybe. I think you could also read it as in a larger sense that he sort of is that. Like he is like his wife's memento mori in that way, like, or like he's remembering her death and he is a constant reminder of it. I don't know. I think there's multiple ways to kind of read it. I do think the bell is an example of that. I think in the film we get there's like a hairbrush and a book and a few other things that are lingered on for a while that you could say are memento moris themselves in the way, because they're reminding him of his deceased wife. But I just thought that was interesting when I saw that was the name of it.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar. That's cool. I'm glad that I know that now. You reminded me of a scene that I wanted to talk about in the mental institution where he is kind of scoffing at himself about the signs that are up on the walls, and one of them specifically is like, if you're gonna light up another cigarette, make sure that the one there's not already a lit one, and he kind of like scoffs at himself, and he like turns around to find a lit one in the ashtray, which just goes to show that like it's been like 10 minutes, if that, since his last like flip over. So just to be in that mindset, like he goes from like laughing at himself, like how could I forget that, to being like shocked and realizing like how like bad his situation is, because it did just happen to him.
I mean, and that's one thing that I think is consistent for both, is it's like it almost stretches believability that you would be able to function at all.
Oh, definitely. And that's what I mean, like because he has his memories from before, I get it. But what happens 20 years from then when like everything, like he's living in a totally different world, or like even 10 years later?
Or it just seems like it'd be so easy to just get completely lost, especially in the movie where he's like free and out and just like going wherever he wants to go.
Right.
And I know he has his Polaroids and he has his system, but it's just enough, I guess, for me to suspend disbelief.
Yeah.
But if I really think about it, I'm like, man, it would be so hard to just function from the moment to moment.
We have to suspend disbelief that each time he flips over, he's going through his notes and going through his photos and going through everything, reliving every single thing in order to get to that point, just so he can be caught up from the last kind of memory at the time that he had. He would have to go through all of his notes, go through all of his tattoos to figure out what he's doing, where he's going, and we just have to assume that he does that every single time before it.
Or that there's some level of conditioning there where he just kind of intuitively remembers it, even though maybe he can't put words to it. He just kind of knows that that's what he's doing. Possible.
Right.
So I wanted to talk about the last line here because I thought it was interesting. The final line of the story is, "Life is a cheap parlor trick." And I thought it was worth noting that there's no period at the end of that sentence, which...
what's funny is I just assumed that Esquire, it was like a typo or something.
No, definitely not. Definitely a choice, in my opinion. And you know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it was a choice because it makes sense to me. Because I read that like, maybe the author, aka the narrator, right, the Earl himself, goes on like this, on one hand, or forgot to put a period, right? Like almost like just a little like nod to forgetfulness that maybe exists in all of us, or especially this character. So I don't know. I don't know that it means exactly one thing, but I think it does have some sort of meaning, in my opinion.
It would be tough to nail it down, but yeah, I like what you're saying with like the idea. Maybe like in that moment, he's been able to recount everything to himself or the audience or whatever he's trying to do, because he does it. He does address himself sometimes and say like, "I wish that you could understand this, and I wish that you could know this and this." And he's not saying it to us; he's saying it to himself from the past. He's or like from the future or whatever it is. He's like, "I wish I could articulate all this stuff to you." So it's like, it is almost like he's telling himself, and then he's also telling us, and then maybe that there at the end, he was he like the memory clicked over, and he was like starting a new cycle, and like maybe he didn't have, like he couldn't write the period because it was just like, what am I doing?
Yeah, I don't know, man. Interesting choice, definitely, by Jonathan Nolan. Esquire magazine, by the way, I don't know anything about their how you get a story published there. I assume they're a market that you have to have an agent who knows how to get a hold of somebody there. They probably don't take unsolicited. Anyway, just the writer in me is like, is Esquire magazine taking short stories? Because they're definitely a market you don't hear about a lot. At least I don't, publishing a ton of short stories. But I don't have a subscription or anything, so maybe I'm wrong. But it's always interesting when you hear stuff like that. I bet he got paid more than 5 cents a word. Let's just say that.
Well, especially after it was said that it's the source material for Memento, the film that already came out.
That already came out, yeah. So speaking of the film that already came out, I am excited to move on and talk about that. But we got to do a little bit of housekeeping before we do, because we have a big milestone coming up.
Yeah, we're coming up on 100. This is episode 99, and I can't believe we're here. We're 1 week away from our 100th episode.
Penultimate episode. Is it season 1? Is that what the first 100 is? Are we 100 episode seasons?
100 episode seasons. That's
No, it feels like we're already in our like third season. Just my feeling of it. I don't maybe more. I don't know. We've never really thought of it that way, but I don't know, man. Yeah, I'm astounded that we're coming up on our 100th episode. It's really cool, and we're doing a couple things surrounding it to sort of celebrate and to move ahead past it. And one of the things we're doing is we're inviting you, our listener, to answer a question and send it to us in a recording using like the app on your phone, voice memo app, something like that. Keep the clip under 60 seconds and answer one of 3 questions, which are, James.
What's a novel that you want to see adapted?
Yes.
What is your favorite? What is your favorite adaptation?
Yes. And
what's the third one?
What's an upcoming adaptation you're excited about?
There it is.
That's it. So those are the 3 questions. We have no preference. Pick whichever one interests you most. Include your first name and where you're from, and answer that question. Send it to us, and we'll include you in the episode. We still have slots that we can fit some more people in. We're excited to do it. And it'll give us something to talk about on the episode. We're going to talk about all of these different topics. And hopefully you take us up on that. inktofilm@gmail.com is where you're going to want to send those. And
we're also doing a Patreon special offer. If you're a patron by, August 12th?
11th.
August 11th.
Yep.
If you're a patron by August 11th, you'll be getting a coin for a jukebox that you can put towards any project that you are interested in us covering. You know, even if your project doesn't get enough coins, we still move it up the list and would like to cover it.
Yeah, we'll consider it like a vote towards like, hey, I want this thing. One of the cool things, too, that I don't know if we've mentioned in the past, if we end up doing a project that has tokens towards it, but it hasn't been fully paid off, like unlocked, if we end up doing one of those tokens will get refunded to the people who put them there, and you'll be able to put them on another project. So in that way, you might be able to get more than one thing out of it. You know, if you think of it that way.
Yeah, you can kind of vote and then maybe get your coin back and vote again.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. I think it's cool. It's a cool way for the listeners to kind of dictate what they want to listen to. And ultimately, I'm excited to see like what weird stuff we cover next.
Yeah, and that's patrons at all levels, so you don't have to do the Jukebox Hero like higher level thing that normally gets tokens. This is going to be across all levels. You're going to get a token, and also we just put out our 15th special Patreon episode this last week, and that was covering the adaptation news and trailers that came out of Comic-Con 2019, San Diego Comic-Con, I should say.
Yeah, that was fun. We talked about a lot of interesting projects. Honestly, everything I'm looking forward to for the most part. And then we got into some Marvel talk. So if you want to hear us talk some comic stuff.
We watched the trailer for It Chapter 2 and The Watchmen and several like that. We watched them. We like paused the episode, went and watched them, came back, and gave our like immediate reactions. So if you want to hear that, definitely another reason to sign up. That and 14 other episodes that we've already done as bonus content are waiting for you on Patreon. That's patreon.com/inktofilm.
So we've already talked about the film here and there, but let's move into full spoilers, talk about everything.
Yeah, let's do it. We're long enough into the episode. Let's just go full spoilers.
Right, yeah. So let's jump back to the Sammy Jankis stuff, because we wanted to talk about that, and I had kind of posed the stuff to you.
Okay. So what happens is Teddy reveals that he kind of pokes at Leonard and says, "Do you know who you are? That's who you were. Do you know who you are?" And you don't have any idea, right? And one of the things he says is that he essentially says, "You are Sammy Jankis. You're one and the same person." And then we have this moment where Leonard has a flashback to his wife, where he remembered pinching her and her saying "ow," and then he has like it flashes to him giving her a injection, and she says "ow," and then it flashes back as he goes no, she wasn't diabetic, and then it flashes back to the pinch, and this is all in relation to the Sammy Jankis story, which is essentially about a guy who had his same condition that he investigated when he was an insurance investigator, and long story short, his wife essentially committed suicide by testing him and telling him to keep giving her these insulin shots and testing to see if he would remember that he'd already given them to her, and he didn't, because she was convinced that he was faking. And the supposition that Teddy is making is that is actually Leonard's story, that his wife survived the assault and that she ended up actually dying from this happening. And so I want to ask you, do you think that this is true?
No, I don't think so. But I don't know. I think it's ultimately left up to interpretation. It's not how I interpreted it, but I didn't think that he was. I think it's possible that that's what Christopher Nolan wanted you to think, but I think for me, I didn't think that Sammy Jankis and him were one and the same.
Okay, even with the frame of swapping him out in the institution and all that.
Yeah, mostly because I mean, like I said, I think that he's playing with it. I think that it's like, it's obvious that he wants you to think that. Whether it ultimately is that or not, I don't think he answers. I think that it's left up to interpretation. But
I definitely agree with that. I definitely think this is open-ended in that sense.
Yeah, but my main thing was when he was telling him that he killed his wife with the insulin. I guess my main reason for thinking that he wasn't Sammy was because he remembers everything before he got the injury, and unless his wife developed diabetes, she wasn't diabetic before the injury.
Well, but then that memory of him, the pinch that swapped to a insulin shot, would have been from before the injury.
Right, but
so
he would be
was
like
potentially a memory that he has just trained himself to forget.
Right. I mean, maybe like I said, but that was my main standing ground. Okay. The reason why I felt like it wasn't.
Well, and if you read it that way, then Leonard is more heroic in this film, in a sense, because Teddy was manipulating him fully, right? Like completely lying to him and trying to convince him of something that's not true.
Yeah, and I think that the movie flip-flops on that. I think that initially you're like, Teddy's clearly a bad guy, and then you're like, oh wow, Teddy's like a bad guy, but in a different way than we thought. Like, we thought he was like the rapist murderer, but it turns out he's just a dirty cop, and then it kind of flips back to maybe he was more involved.
Well, and I think there's a middle ground there where you actually think that he's killed an innocent man too, right? Like, there's a little while where, like, he seems like, oh, this guy was actually trying to help him out, and he ended up killing him. What the hell? Because I felt like there was a lot of moments in the movie, because it goes on a long time, where you don't know why he wrote, "Don't believe his lies."
Yeah.
And it's really interesting how that one line he writes on the back of that thing, which we don't really get the genesis of that until the end of the movie, and it immediately ripples backwards through the rest of the movie, and we can see how it changed everything.
Yeah, it dictates how we see Teddy throughout, because we're like, okay, we are believing our narrator. Like our initial reaction as the audience is to believe our narrator, because in most films you have a reliable narrator, but we don't have a reliable narrator.
Well, and by narrator, do you mean like the author of the notes, like who wrote the notes?
I just mean like our character, like our main character, because he clearly wrote to himself. He wrote, don't trust his lies. So not trusting his lies means that you're setting up the audience to not trust him throughout the entire movie, no matter what he says or how good he seems.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, he has to trust in the infallibility of these notes. And that's the tricky thing, because, and that's like the nature of memory that gets discussed in the thing. Like, it's just not, he talks about facts, and it's so funny how, like, facts even themselves can be slippery, right? And what do they mean, and the interpretations of them. And we see him making snap judgments and writing things down that future him takes as gospel, and doesn't remember the context in which it was written.
Well, like clearly, and the biggest moment of that is at the very end when he just decides like Teddy's a bad guy, and I'm gonna write down his license plate number and set him up as the murderer. Like in my own mind, in my own future mind.
You can be my John G. And
exactly.
So I read it differently. I think he is Sammy Jankis. And I think Teddy is telling him that in the moment, and revealing to him that he's been using his revenge lust to take out people. Teddy is a bad dude. He's been using I think he's telling the truth when he says he was the cop who was investigating him.
He was trying to get the money and like take advantage of the situation, yeah.
And then he decided he actually, I think he did actually kill John G. Although even that they give it in such a way of like, maybe there isn't a John G, maybe he never existed. But then he says like, no, they were just a couple of junkies who didn't, were too strung out to realize there was another person home, I think is what he says. So I'm taking that to be true. And then I also think that the Sammy Jankis is Leonard story is true. And so I think that makes what happens there a lot darker, because what I see there is Leonard choosing to craft a reality that is more comforting to him. And he's choosing he wants to erase what he's done in the same way that he burns the photo, right? The proof of him having murdered these men, he burns those. And the smile that he has on his face in that one photo of like just after he killed him the first time, right? Supposedly. He burns those photos, and he sets up this Teddy to be John G, to erase that part of him so he doesn't have to live in a world where A, he killed his wife, and B, he's gone on to kill all these other people.
Right. And I think that is the more dark, because it does feel like the way that Nolan would be telling a story would be unconventional. He wouldn't want it to have the happy ending. He wouldn't want it to have something that seems... I don't know, like I said, conventional. It just isn't set up to be that kind of a movie. So for it to kind of have more of a happy ending and more of a, or at least an ending with a character who has a little less like blood on their hands, it makes sense for it to be darker.
Yeah, and I think the reason I like that, and I kind of went into the movie, because like we talked about, like it's hard to keep this whole movie in your head at the same time sometimes, especially after long periods of not having seen it. And so I went in going like, isn't he Sammy Jankis? Isn't that what's the reveal that happened at the end, right? And so I was kind of remembering that. And so from the whole movie, I was sort of watching it with that view. Mm-hmm. And so it colored all the earlier scenes where he was talking about the problems that Sammy Jankis had with not having a system. Like his problem was he didn't have a system. His problem was this. Like he says that several times, and that reminds me of like the story when he's like calling himself an idiot and stuff. Like it's like it almost like he has externalized past versions of himself that were worse off and like couldn't handle things so badly that it led to the death of his wife. And so he's externalized that as this other person who he can distance himself from and say, I am not like Sammy Jankis. I'm not going to make the same mistakes.
So
yeah.
So just a question on basically the situation with the diabetes thing for you is that he remembers it as a pinch, and then Teddy makes him remember it as a poke, as like an insulin shot, and then like what Nolan's trying to say with it going back to the pinch is him making the decision to remember it that way.
Yes, I think so. Because he talks about how memory can change the color of a car, can change, like he was talking about how fallible it is and eyewitness testimony, which is true. And I think that's him making the decision that he doesn't want to remember it that way. That was how I read that scene.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I'm starting to lean more into your territory for sure.
It's okay. I honestly think it's like Blade Runner, man. Like, I think this is a movie that is open-ended and open to interpretation. Maybe, and I'm just glad there's not like 3 different versions out there.
Well, no, I definitely think that it is, and I think there's still some clues there to say that maybe it is the more happy ending. But as far as like what you brought up with the whole movie's about memory. So like if the ending wasn't about memory as well, and the way that that it's subjective and the way that it can change, I think that makes a lot of sense for like what story he was trying to tell.
Let's talk a little bit about Carrie-Anne Moss as Natalie in this movie, because I think she's a really interesting character, and I love the way there's these reveals, right? And the whole time we're thinking that he has this love connection with her, and she's this like, character who's just helping him out of the goodness of her heart and all this stuff, and then there's all of a sudden that reveal of just how terrible she was to him, and then the gut punch of him of knowing that he forgets it, right? And that's the scene. She causes him to forget it by hiding the pens. Like, she knows he'll forget it and is completely manipulating him. Man. And
that's the scene from the book that, like, just when he's trying to find the pen too, you're just like, oh my God, she grabbed the pens on her way out. Like, she was that vindictive about it. She was like, she knew how to manipulate him, how to take advantage of him. And like, it's used against us, the audience, as well, because we assume that she is from the kindness of her heart helping him.
There's an interesting part too where he's feeling his fist, because he's asking her like how she got hurt.
Yeah,
she says that Dodd did it, but then he like feels his fist and he can tell that he's like hit something recently.
That's the main reason why, like, if you're looking for it, when he was doing that in this viewing, I remembered, I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly, it's because this whole thing plays out again in a second. She comes back in and he punches her, and like that's how it all went down. But that like hand like kind of looking at his knuckles gave it away.
But it's also like him, it's also saying something about perception, though. Like, it's like what he wants to believe. Like, he doesn't want to believe that he hit her. That doesn't make any sense. So he ignores that. It's like the fallibility of our perceptions and of our memories, and it's all just like turned up to 11 here because of his condition, but it's in a way it's talking about our own perceptions, right, too.
I want to talk about the scene in the bar where she gets that guy to spit in the cup, and then she spits in the cup, and he spits in the cup, and then she like gives it to him.
Mm-hmm. That guy's laugh.
So the way it plays out is so interesting, because we get it and she's like, I think this one's a little dusty. That's the first time, that's really the first instance we get of the cup. And then the scene plays out backwards where we see like why she took it away.
Yeah. We hear the guy's laugh, which I think is so ridiculous and like over the top, because it's noticeable and you're going to remember like, why did that fucker laugh like that?
Right. Yeah. And then to see it play out the way it does, and then to see him still drink it at the end of the scene to lead into that scene where she like it was just it's cool. It kind of reminds me of that cigarette scene from the story. Yeah,
for sure. Did you notice that there is a young Tom Lennon in this movie?
No, I didn't. Really? Where? When?
He is administering the test for Sammy Jankis in the flashback, in the black and white flashback.
Wow, yeah.
He's the guy that he gives him the finger. He's like, fuck you, or whatever. Like, that guy is Tom Lennon from Reno 911. That's awesome.
He's hilarious, man.
I thought that was pretty funny. Yeah, man. What about the reveal where he's been talking to this guy on the phone for all this time and scratching at his tattoo? Yeah. And then he lifts the bandage and it says never talk on the phone or something like that, and never answer the phone. And he's like, wait, who is this? And he realizes he doesn't even know who this person is on the phone, and I don't know, man. Like that gives me chills just thinking about it.
Well, that, and we haven't even really talked about that whole like black and white, forward moving story that we get, which meets up basically. The two stories meet up at the end, like the beginning of one and the end of the other.
That's why I said it's kind of the middle, because you have the one linear story of the black and white that's broken up, but is still progressing linearly. And then you have the backward story, and then they reach each other, and at this middle moment. Right. And that's where we also learn that Teddy is the one who's been on the phone with him. It seems.
Right.
All along.
I love the high contrast shots and everything that we get, which is very like film noir, like smoky rooms, talking on the telephone, just all screams film noir to me. And it like I feel a kinship to film noir, and I have for a long time because like the first short film that I directed was like a satirical film noir. So like it's always like anything film noir, I feel like I'm really keyed in on like looking at visual aesthetics and like kind of the tropes and you know. It was just a lot of fun to look at this because that's kind of I was thinking what was Christopher Nolan thinking when he wanted to approach a modern noir film.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's cool to take something sort of like old school and classic and then reimagine it. Like I think that's always a fun exercise, and I do think that's what this movie is. Now I caught so I was in the habit of pausing this movie at times, and at the end of the movie I paused it because there's a few frames. I caught for the first time, and I've seen this movie like 8 or 9 times. This is the first time I've caught it. There are few frames when he's driving away from having just decided to set up Teddy and go, because what he's doing is he's driving to the tattoo shop to get the license plate tattooed on his thigh as a fact.
Right.
And that's the other thing. That combined with Don't Believe His Lies, once you get those two things into motion, like it's going to end in him killing this guy because he knows he's a John G, right?
Right.
And when he's driving towards that, he's thinking, and he's like, he's like having doubt, I think, about what am I making up stories? Am I wrong? And then he like snaps out of it, and he goes, no, you know, like I can't remember the exact line, but he essentially snaps out of it and decides that he's doing the right thing, right? Do you remember this part at the end?
Yeah, there's actually like in that moment, there's also like a music cue, like the score kind of like is settling and it's like more somber, and then it's like no, and it's like it like perks back
wakes
up,
yeah,
and it kind of is just like he's like,
and he comes to a screeching halt at the tattoo parlor,
right? And that's like the very end, really.
Yeah. So during that, there are interspersed scenes of him laying in bed with his wife, and she's like touching his chest. And
I know
he
what you're gonna
has
say.
all the tattoos.
He has a new tattoo, yeah, I saw
and he
that.
has a new tattoo over his heart. And did you stop it and see what it says?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what it was now, though. I didn't stop it. I saw what it said. It said, like, I did it or something, or...
Yeah, it says, I've done it, I think, is what I was able to catch. Which you actually have to, like, pause it. I think there might be one frame where you can see the whole word. Otherwise, you have to kind of, like, read it in parts. But yeah, it says, I've done it, and it's over his heart. So what is that is the question. What is that scene?
And the problem with that is leads back to why that's why it is open-ended, right? Is because it's the scene where it said the tattoo clearly says I did it, and you're like, okay, so this is Nolan saying that he did it, but his wife is with him.
His wife is alive.
And she's dead. So that's not a reliable scene.
Yeah, because if he's Sammy Jankis at all, she's dead because of the insulin. If he's just Leonard, she's dead because that's how he remembers it going down.
Right.
So the only thing I can think of is that this is... So in my opinion, what this is the moment that we see a little bit of the catharsis of having achieved the vengeance that he wanted. He's imagining it by setting up John G, right? He's setting up Teddy to be John G, and he's imagining the catharsis. And maybe that's also tied up with what Teddy told him about how he has killed him in the past. Like, you already killed your John G.
Right.
This is him like having a momentary catharsis of having achieved a victory, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that is the imagining of his like loving wife being back in his arms and him having the tattoo that he's been saving the spot for over his heart. And then I think the reason it's so fleeting and it's there and gone in an instant is because he immediately forgets this moment of catharsis. Right. It's immediately gone.
Yep. Yeah.
Like so that was my reading of that little frame there.
And that makes sense.
So I think it's kind of a fantasy, not a real scene. Because if it's a real scene, it completely throws everything into fucking...
Exactly. Yeah. I don't think it could have been a real scene either. But yeah, like what you said, because we talked about the segments that he lives his life in, and it's like, for him to have built up all of this and like I was talking about before, he'd have to learn everything he knew every single time he reverts and like has to be reminded of everything that's happened up to this point since his wife's death. It's been building to that, right? It's been building to that moment where he can be like, I did it. And even though he did it, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because all that it means is that he's made the decision, it's going to happen, but he's never going to be able to live a normal life where he can feel any sort of like vengeance or any sort of like accomplishment for any period of time other than momentary, like, 10-minute spans or whatever his in the movie are.
Even with my reading of him being Sammy Jankis, him deciding to kill Teddy is still probably the right decision, right? Because this guy is essentially using him to commit murders, regardless. Whether or not he is Sammy Jankis, right, he's using him to kill people. And he's either using him to kill people just because he's fully abusing and using him, or because he killed John G. originally, and then now it's just useful to keep repeating this cycle. Either way, Teddy was bad, right? So in that sense, you know what I mean? He's not like completely a villain at the end. Right. So a couple other things. I noticed that in that flash, those few frames, his face is actually very neutral. His wife looks sort of like happy. She's looking at the words on his chest. But his face, he's kind of like leaning back and just kind of like blankly looking upward. And so he's not happy, but he's not necessarily sad. I noticed he's clean shaven instead of this sort of like more scraggly look that he has in several other parts of the movie. So I don't know what all of that means. Other than maybe that's like his imagined version of himself, or he doesn't know how to feel about it, or he can, like, it's so transient that there's no real happiness there. I don't know what that means and why he wasn't smiling, for example, in that flash.
Yeah.
Maybe he's conflicted about it. I don't know. And he does say, also, I have the line here. He says, "We all need mirrors to remind ourselves who we are. I'm not different." And that's kind of where he flashes and like settles into like convincing himself that he has done the right thing.
Wasn't that? I think that's in the short film, or in the short story. I'm pretty sure that line's from the short story as well.
Maybe,
because there were like one or two other times that I heard almost exact lines from the short story. So I don't know if it's exact, but what was the line that you said again?
"We all need mirrors to remind ourselves who we are. I'm not different."
Yeah, so in the short story, the line is, "After all, everybody else needs mirrors to remind themselves who they are. You are no different." Yeah,
so essentially the same thing, yeah. Except for you get that modified POV. So what? Now that's not the end of the story, though, right? Like that's somewhere towards the middle, right?
Yeah, that's like 3/4.
Yeah, but it's an interesting observation, right? And that's what do you take from that? Like the idea that we need a mirror to remind ourselves who we are. What does that mean?
Well, I think it's interesting because it's like a moment of reflection and introspection and like seeing like checking in with yourself. And I think that it's interesting because a character in his point of view or his situation can't really reflect or have any introspection on like anything that's happened recently to them. It's like they can only reflect on what they were. They can't reflect on like what's currently going on.
I think there's a lot talking about like living in the moment and how he's forced to live in the moment. We all are forced to live in the moment. And in a sense, looking in a mirror is sort of like the evidence of a past self, because you see the person that has been built up through a life. You see whether or not you're overweight, or you see whether or not you have a scar, or you see, like that's the evidence of a past. And you normally like, yeah, you might be able to look down and see it, but I think it's symbolically you're looking in a mirror, seeing the whole package. Like that's me. And that's proof of a life lived outside of this moment where we all sort of exist, right, in our minds. And I think maybe that's what they're trying to get at. Yeah. And he's saying that we're all like that, but for him, it's just he absolutely has to look in the mirror because he has absolutely no memory otherwise.
Right. And like his memories are like on his body and yeah. I think that you're right. I think that's hitting the nail on the head there.
Well, I think that sounds like a good place because we were able to link the short story to the movie, which is always fun. So I think that's probably a good spot. It seems like there's a lot more we could delve into with this movie. We didn't even really talk about the beginning, which I think is really interesting. This like played in reverse shot of him. It starts the movie off of a Polaroid picture of a man who's been shot in the head, and then the picture slowly like fades in reverses time, and then we see him catch a gun and then shoot a man in the head who we don't know and who's like calling, like begging for his own life. So this movie starts out like pitch black, really, really dark. And that immediately grabs you too.
And that's a genius shot to start with. That's iconic at this point. Just the you're getting a Polaroid, and then the flicking, the shaking of a Polaroid picture, it fading out over time. Like that's just a genius way to start a movie right there. So cool. It's picturesque. It's really deep. There's a lot of meaning in it, and you know, like the entire story is kind of just symbolically playing out with that that one shot.
Absolutely, man. And that's the thing, man. We've talked about it. This is a unified film of form, of every little flair that's done, the way that the forward in time, backward in time unifies, the nature of the climax, and the way that it ripples back through the rest of the story. All of this is done with intention. All of it's done in ways that just builds on itself. Nothing feels like an extraneous flourish. To me, it all feels integrated. And that's why, I don't know who was talking about this movie to you like that, but I could respect the idea, but ultimately I disagree, because I think this movie is amazing, and I think it does have a really powerful climax that makes you think. And I think it's ambiguous, but I think when you really dig into it, it's rewarding. And at least this experience watching it was maybe my best yet, just because I was able to dig into it so much and read the short story. But it's really elevated this movie once again, even higher than I already held it in high esteem from before this.
Yeah, and I think the main thing to point to with that would be it's not a typical movie in like in a narrative sense, and I think that, like, you know, change and things that are different typically will, you know, sometimes turn certain people off. So it's just really, you know, comes down to preference, and I think I mean, art's subjective.
If this all just sounds too complicated, and you know what I mean, like you watched it and you were like, it was just too complicated, and I couldn't, not to say like you couldn't follow it, but like you didn't want to, like it just threw you too much and you weren't interested in having to work that hard. Right. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing wrong with that. You're not inherently wrong. That's just how you prefer to enjoy watching movies. I wouldn't want all my movies to be like this, right? Like it's a unique experience that I happen to enjoy. But I think it's time to move on. I do want to give a shout out to my brother Ben, because he wrote us and said this is his absolute favorite movie. He even said not my favorite movie like James says favorite movie, but my real favorite movie.
I'm gonna have to start defending my favorite movies a little better. My thing is, it's just like I've got millions of favorite movies. You can't tell me otherwise.
Yeah. No, man, I commented on our Council of Inklings. I had like a thing of favorite movies, and I put 3 out there, but I immediately wanted to like add 3 more. I'm like, yeah, here's my next 3. Like it was so hard. I just made myself do it as an exercise, but
it feels like it feels like a slippery slope to me. Like I start picking my favorite movie, and then it's just like not true. So I don't know.
Yeah. An hour later, you're like, that's not even right.
Yeah. I mean, I could give somebody like my top 100 films or something crazy like that, but like, but like short of that, like you're not going to.
One of these days, I'm going to pin you down, and we're going to do like a top 10. No particular order or something.
I can also say that like there are movies, like I'm perfectly comfortable saying that like Fellowship of the Ring is one of the films that made me like, you know, as into film. It really like engaged me, and it's one of the movies that it's the reason why I'm involved in filmmaking. So, you know, in that sense, that's probably like one of my favorite movies, period. Yeah. Like you know, top 3 movies of all time.
And one of these days I'm going to force you to choose 10 movies, and that's just going to be it. You're only going to get 10 and that's it. And you're going to have to choose. We'll do it.
You got to give me like a year's notice.
No, maybe we'll do it on our 100th episode. That could be fun.
Yeah. I'll do my best.
Think about it.
I'll give you 10 plus like 50 more. This is what we'll do. Give me a genre and give me at least like a decade.
Give me 20, my top 20 from each genre in each decade. No. Nobody wants that, James. We want to force you to pick 10.
All right.
That's what we want.
Maybe I'll do it.
Okay. We'll think about it. I do want to there's going to be, I think I have an idea for a little teaser thing, a little stinger here. I think at the very end of this episode, we should reveal what our project is going to be following the 100th episode, which I don't think we've said yet. So that could be cool. So stick around to the very end, and we're going to reveal that. But before we do, we want to thank our new patron, Carlos R. Thank you so much for becoming a patron. We really appreciate it. You help keep this podcast going. We're happy to have you along for this, and you're going to get a token with all of the other patrons, and we're happy to have you, man. And if you want to find out how to become a patron, go to patreon.com/inktofilm.
Connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at inktofilm. And join the Council of Inklings, because it's the best place to hear some adaptation news that we post on there, get involved in some of the polls that we put out in order to do our bonus episodes and also our normal feed episodes. It's just a fun place to interact, and I always like seeing people post in there.
Yeah, also good place to dump all your adaptation-related memes. We appreciate adaptation memes. Lord of the Rings memes, Stephen King memes. They're all welcome. Even for projects we haven't covered yet. Council of Inklings, for sure, check it out. Also, if you could leave us a rating and review on whatever platform you use, or on Facebook, or just anywhere where you can do it, that would be hugely helpful. That's a free way you can help the podcast out. Another free way is to tell a friend who you think might like this podcast, tell them about it, and we would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you to Jennifer Delazana for providing our transcripts, and thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man, so let's do the stinger now, and I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about maybe we should take the very end of the episode and put it right at the front, but I don't think we're going to do that. But we thought about doing it, maybe. Maybe we'll do something else. I don't know. I want to reveal our next project, and this is not going to be the 100th episode. It's going to be the 101. We're going to be covering Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which is a new movie that I am excited to see, but I'm even more excited to talk about the book, because it was an absolute classic for me growing up.
Yeah, I remember reading like one or two of the stories in there, but honestly couldn't tell you much about it. So I'm excited. I'm basically going in blind. I've seen one of the trailers. I'm looking forward to it. Guillermo del Toro's involved, so I'm gonna check it out.
Yeah, it looks dark. It looks twisted. My favorite thing about the books is the art, honestly, more than the stories. I'm going to be interested to kind of dig back into those. I know they're kind of based off of urban legends, so that'll be cool. But yeah, I hope the movie's going to be good. Either way, we're going to talk about it. Episode 101. All right, we will see you for episode 100. Until then,
thank you for listening.